He was 18 years old, and the world gave him a cardboard box. Inside was a worn-out hoodie, a handful of paperbacks with cracked spines, and a thin manila envelope. This was the sum total of his life, the official inventory of a childhood spent in the care of the state. The social worker, a woman named Carol, with tired eyes and a kind but practiced smile, had said, "Happy birthday, Leo. You're a man now." It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like an eviction. What she discovered next, in that flimsy envelope, wouldn't just be about an inheritance. It would be about a debt he never knew he owed. If you've ever felt like the world has already decided who you are, make sure you subscribe, because this story is for you. This is about how I learned that the things we truly own are the things no one can ever take away. The day I aged out of the system was cold for a Tuesday in May. A damp, insistent chill clung to the cinder-block walls of the group home. A final, clammy handshake from a place I'd never called home, but had been my only shelter. I sat on the edge of the stripped mattress, the springs groaning a weary complaint, and stared at the box. 18 years. It didn't seem possible that a life could be condensed into such a small, sad container. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying, exhilarating emptiness that stretched out before me. Freedom, they called it. It felt more like being pushed out of an airplane without a parachute. I had a voucher for a room in a halfway house downtown, $400 in state-provided startup cash, and a future as blank and intimidating as a fresh sheet of paper. I traced the corner of the manila envelope. My name, Leo Vance, was typed neatly on the front, below the return address of a law firm in a town I'd never heard of. Abernathy and Sons, Creek Bend, Wyoming. I slid it open with my thumbnail. The paper inside was thick, expensive. It was a letter dated 2 weeks prior, formally notifying me of the death of my aunt, Elena Vance. I had to read the sentence twice. Elena, my mother's older sister, a ghost from a life I could barely remember. She'd passed away nearly 2 years ago. The letter was a formality, a final piece of estate administration. It explained, in dry legal terms, that her sole significant asset, a 500-acre parcel of land, had been transferred to my cousins, Mark and Sarah, her closest living adult relatives at the time. Since I was a minor in state custody, the court had appointed a guardian ad litem who, finding no liquid assets in the estate to warrant a protracted legal battle for a ward of the state, had signed off on the transfer. It was all legal, all tidy, all done without me ever knowing. The letter concluded by stating that a few of her personal effects had been held in trust and were now legally mine. A key was taped to the bottom of the page. It was old, iron, and heavy. It felt like a key to a forgotten story. I didn't feel grief, not yet. Grief requires memory, and my memories of Elena were faint and dreamlike. The scent of pine needles, the rough texture of a wool blanket, a low, gentle voice humming a song I couldn't place. What I felt was a hollow echo, the confirmation of a loss I hadn't even known to mourn. I was an orphan. Now I was an orphan who had apparently been too inconvenient to inherit. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had processed me, efficiently and without fuss. My cousins had a farm. I had a key to a box of memories that weren't even mine. That night, in the sterile quiet of the halfway house, surrounded by the ghosts of other boys who had been pushed out into the world, I held that key in my hand. It was cold and solid. It was the only thing in my life that felt real. It was the beginning of a journey I didn't know I was about to take, a journey back to a place I'd never been, to reclaim something I never knew I'd lost. It wasn't about the land, not really. It was about finding out who Elena Vance was, and in doing so, finding out who I was supposed to be. The first phone call I made as a legal adult was to Abernathy and Sons. A reedy, tired voice answered on the third ring. "Abernathy, It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as if the man himself were as old and weathered as the name of his firm. I explained who I was, my voice cracking slightly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the faint rustle of paper. "Leo Vance," he said, his tone shifting from weary to something more focused, something that sounded almost like regret. "Yes, I've been expecting you might call." His name was George Abernathy, the and Sons, a relic of a past when his father and grandfather had practiced law from the same dusty office. He was the one who had handled Elena's estate. He spoke in short, precise sentences, laying out the facts like stones in a cold riverbed. My aunt had died suddenly of a heart attack. Her will was simple. Everything she owned was to go to me. But I was 16, a ward of the state hundreds of miles away. My cousins, Mark and Sarah, had emerged from the woodwork immediately. They lived in a neighboring county, had barely spoken to Elena in years. But they were adults, they were family, and they had a lawyer. They petitioned the court, claiming the estate was insolvent, that the land was nothing but worthless scrub, burdened by back taxes. They offered to assume the debt in exchange for the title. The court-appointed guardian for my case, an overworked public attorney with a caseload the size of a phone book, agreed. It was the path of least resistance, a clean, simple solution for a complicated, messy life. "It wasn't right," Abernathy said, and the admission hung in the air between us. "But it was legal. Your aunt, she was a proud woman, and a private one. She didn't have much cash. On paper, your cousin's assessment looked correct. The land was valued low, the taxes were high." He sighed, a faint, papery sound. "I sent you the key because she made me promise I would. It's for the front door of her cabin. The court granted you access to retrieve her personal effects. Your cousins weren't happy about it, but it was in the will. Unequivocal." I clutched the phone, the cheap plastic slick in my palm. "What's there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, son. She never told me. Just said it was important, said that when you were old enough, you'd know what to do with it." He paused again. "There's a bus ticket waiting for you at the Greyhound station, paid for from the estate's trust account. It leaves tomorrow morning." The bus ride was 22 hours of rumbling monotony, a journey across a flat, indifferent landscape that mirrored the emptiness inside me. I watched the world blur past the greasy window, a succession of truck stops and forgotten towns. With every mile that passed, the concrete towers of the city receded, replaced by an ever-widening sky. I felt like I was traveling backward in time, heading toward a past that wasn't mine. I thought about my cousins. I had a vague memory of them from family gathering when I was very young, before my mother died. Mark was older with a loud, booming laugh that had scared me. Sarah was quiet, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. They were strangers who had laid claim to the only piece of my history I had left. What did 500 acres even look like? In my mind, it was an impossible kingdom, a vast expanse of green that I couldn't comprehend. The thought that it had been mine, and now wasn't, left a bitter taste in my mouth. It was another tick mark in a long list of things the world had taken from me. I arrived in Creek Bend, Wyoming, just after dawn. The town was little more than a wide spot in the road, a collection of single-story buildings huddled together against the vast, empty plains. The air was thin and cold, smelling of dust and sagebrush. It was so quiet I could hear the hum of the vending machine inside the tiny bus depot. A battered pickup truck, the color of rust and faded hope, was parked outside. An old man with a deeply lined face and a tweed jacket that had seen better decades stood leaning against it. He looked up as I stepped out, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Leo Vance?" he asked. I nodded. "George Abernathy," he said, extending a hand that was surprisingly strong. "Welcome to Creek Bend. Let's go see what your aunt left you." His grip was firm, a small anchor in the disorienting newness of it all. We drove in silence for a while, the truck rattling along a dirt road that seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. The sky was immense, a pale, washed-out blue that dwarfed the rolling brown hills. There was nothing out here, no houses, no fences, no sign of human life. Just the wind whipping across the grasslands in a lonely, mournful sigh. "Your cousins own all this now," Abernathy said, gesturing with a thumb at the endless landscape. "From that ridge there all the way to the creek. They've already got surveyors out here talking about subdividing, selling it off to some developer from California." The words landed like stones in my gut. They weren't just taking the land, they were erasing it. Erasing her. After another 10 minutes, he slowed the truck and pointed. "There it is." In the distance, nestled in a slight depression in the land, was a small, dark shape. As we got closer, it resolved into a cabin. It was small, made of dark, weathered logs, with a sagging porch and a stone chimney that listed slightly to one side. It looked less like a house and more like something that had grown out of the earth itself, ancient and stubborn. It was surrounded by a sea of sagebrush and dry grass, the only vertical thing for miles. It looked profoundly, achingly lonely. Abernathy pulled the truck to a stop a few yards from the porch. The silence that descended when he cut the engine was absolute. It was a living thing, a presence that pressed in on all sides. "The court order gives you 72 hours, he said, his voice low, "to collect any items of a personal or sentimental nature. Your cousins wanted to be here to supervise, but I managed to convince them it was unnecessary. I told them you were just a boy, here to collect a few photographs." He looked at me then, his gaze direct. "I have a feeling your aunt intended for you to find more than that. Don't disappoint her." He handed me a heavy flashlight and a jug of water. "I'll be back the day after tomorrow. The door is yours." He got back in his truck, kicked up a cloud of dust, and drove away, leaving me utterly alone in the vast, silent heart of my stolen inheritance. I stood there for a long time, the iron key clutched in my hand, the wind pulling at my jacket. The cabin watched me, its single dark window like a vacant eye. This was it, the place where the ghost of my past lived. Taking a deep breath, I walked up the creaking steps of the porch. The wood was soft and splintered under my boots. The key was stiff in the lock, but with a grunt of effort, it turned. The heavy wooden door swung inward with a low groan, releasing a breath of cold, stale air that smelled of dust, wood smoke, and something else, something faintly floral like dried lavender. I stepped across the threshold, out of the blinding sunlight and into the gloom. The world outside vanished, and I was standing in Elena Vance's life. The inside of the cabin was a single room, swallowed by shadows. A thick layer of dust coated everything, turning the world a uniform ghostly gray. Sunlight struggled through a single dirty window, illuminating swirling motes of dust in a solitary golden beam. It was like stepping into a photograph from 100 years ago. To my left was a small kitchenette, a cast-iron stove, a hand pump for water, and a few simple wooden shelves holding chipped enamelware plates. To my right was a living area, dominated by a large stone fireplace, its hearth cold and black. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. In the far corner was a narrow bed, neatly made, covered with a thick, hand-stitched quilt. It was Spartan, simple, the home of someone who needed very little from the world. But it didn't feel empty. It felt paused, as if its owner had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. I ran my hand along the back of a wooden chair, my fingers leaving a clean streak in the dust. This was real. She had lived here. She had sat in this chair, eaten at this table, slept in that bed. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. so sharp and sudden it almost buckled my knees. This was the home I could have had. This was the family I had lost twice, once when my mother died, and again when the system gave this away. I walked slowly through the room, my boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. There were books everywhere, stacked on shelves, piled on the floor, tucked into corners. Poetry, history, books on botany and geology. On a small bedside table was a framed photograph face down. I picked it up, wiping the dust from the glass. It was a picture of a woman I didn't recognize, standing next to a much younger version of my mother. They were both smiling, their arms around each other. The woman who had to be Elena had kind eyes and a wide, generous smile. Her hair was pulled back, and she looked strong, capable, at home in the rugged landscape behind her. It was the first time I had ever really seen her face. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the photograph clutched in my hand. What was I even looking for? A box of old letters, a photo album. What personal effects could possibly matter now? Abernathy's words came back to me. I have a feeling your aunt intended for you to find more than that. I looked around the cabin again, trying to see it through her eyes. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress, a place of solitude and self-sufficiency. A person who lived like this didn't do anything by accident. Everything here had a purpose. My gaze fell to the floor. It was made of thick, wide planks of pine, worn smooth by time. Near the hearth, one of the boards looked slightly different from the others. The color was a shade off, the seams around it just a little too perfect. It was subtle, something you would only notice if you were looking for it. My heart started to beat a little faster. I got down on my hands and knees, my breath clouding in the cold air. I ran my fingers along the edge of the board. There, a tiny notch, almost invisible in the rough wood. Using the tip of the iron key, I pried at it. The board resisted for a moment, then lifted with a soft, scraping sound. Beneath it was a dark, hollow space, and inside that space, nestled on a bed of dry lavender, was a metal box. The box was an old military surplus ammunition can, painted olive drab, heavy and cold to the touch. The latches were stiff, but I managed to force them open with a loud metallic clang that echoed in the silent cabin. The air that escaped from inside smelled of old paper and something else, something dry and earthy. My hands were trembling as I lifted the lid. Inside, resting on top of a stack of bundled envelopes, was a thick wad of cash. I pulled it out. It was mostly $100 bills, held together by a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. I didn't count it, but I knew it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. A few $1,000s at least. It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. Beneath the money were the letters, at least a dozen of them, tied together with a simple piece of twine. And under the letters was a single folded document. I carefully unfolded it. It was a property deed. But it wasn't for the 500 acres. The legal description was precise, mapping out a single square acre of land. I scanned the document, my eyes catching the coordinates, the official stamps, the signatures. The owner was listed as Elena Vance. The property was described as Lot B, Section 17, Creek Bend Township. It had been filed and recorded with the county clerk 5 years ago, separate from the main parcel. A single acre carved out from the very heart of the larger property. My cousins, in their haste to absorb the worthless scrubland, and the court, in its bureaucratic efficiency, had missed it entirely. It was a tiny island of ownership in the middle of their sea. My gaze fell back to the letters. The one on top was addressed to me. Leo, my name, written in a strong, elegant script. I untied the twine, my fingers fumbling. The paper was thick and creamy. I began to read. My dearest Leo, the letter began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has finally sent you back to me. I am so sorry. I am sorry for not being there, for not fighting harder to get you out of that system. but they would not have let me. A single woman living out here with no steady income. They would have said I was unfit. They would have seen this place as a hardship, not a sanctuary. And perhaps, in their small way, they would have been right. It is a hard life, but it is a good one. I wanted you to have a choice, Leo, a real one. I couldn't give you the world, so I tried to save you a small piece of it. Her words felt like a conversation across time, her voice rising from the page, calm and clear. The money should be enough to last you a while. The deed is more important. That single acre is yours, free and clear. It was the first piece of this land I ever bought, the heart of it all. I recorded it separately years ago, hoping no one would ever notice. It may not seem like much, but sometimes the smallest things have the most power. Your cousins have the rest. I had to let them have it. It was the only way. To fight them would have brought attention, surveys, assessments. It would have brought the very people I have spent 20 years trying to keep away from this place. I let them take the body, Leo, so that I could save the soul. This land is not what it seems. It holds a secret, a promise. The rest of these letters will explain. Read them in order. But first, you must go to your acre. Find the old well pump near the 3 cottonwoods. What you need to find next is hidden there. Be careful. You are not as alone out here as you think. All my love, Elena. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through a film of tears. It wasn't an apology. It was an explanation, a strategy. She hadn't abandoned me. She had been protecting me, protecting this place in the only way she knew how. She had sacrificed the vast majority of her property, letting her greedy relatives think they had won, all to preserve this one hidden acre and the secret it held. The grief I hadn't been able to feel before now hit me with the force of a physical blow. I cried for the woman I never knew, for the home I never had, and for the fierce secret love she had harbored for me all these years. The money wasn't a gift. It was a tool. The land wasn't a loss. It was a puzzle, and I was standing at the very beginning of it. The next morning I woke to the first light of dawn painting the dusty cabin in shades of pale gold and gray. The air was bitingly cold, and I could see my breath as I sat up on the narrow bed, the quilt pulled tight around my shoulders. For the first time in years, I hadn't dreamed of concrete walls and echoing hallways. I had dreamed of a wide-open sky and a woman's gentle voice humming a half-forgotten tune. The weight of the metal box on the floor beside the bed was a comforting, solid presence. It was proof that the previous day hadn't been a dream. Elena's letter was on the table, its words now etched into my memory. Go to your acre, find the old well pump. I ate a stale granola bar from my backpack and drank deep from the jug of water Abernathy had left me. The silence of the cabin was no longer oppressive. It felt watchful, expectant. I was no longer a trespasser here. I was an heir. Using a compass app on my phone and the coordinates from the deed, I plotted a course. The single acre was almost exactly in the geographic center of the 500-acre parcel, a good 2-mile walk from the cabin. I stuffed the money and the deed deep into my backpack, leaving the other letters in the box, hidden once more beneath the floorboards. I couldn't risk carrying the whole story with me. I stepped out onto the porch, into the crisp morning air. The landscape rolled away in every direction, a tapestry of muted browns and greens under the immense blue dome of the sky. The sheer scale of it was still overwhelming, but now it felt different. It wasn't just empty land my cousins owned. It was a place with a secret, and I was the only one who knew the key. The walk was long and arduous. The ground was uneven, cut with dry gullies and dotted with prickly sagebrush. The sun climbed higher, and the initial chill of the morning gave way to a dry, penetrating heat. I could feel the isolation deep in my bones. There was nothing out here but the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the sound of my own breathing. After more than an hour of walking, I saw them, 3 tall cottonwood trees, their leaves shimmering like silver coins in the breeze. They were an anomaly in the landscape, a sign of water hidden deep beneath the surface. My heart quickened. As I drew closer, I saw it, a rusted cast-iron well pump, standing like a lonely sentinel beside the trees. It was old, the handle seized with rust, the spout choked with dirt. This was it. This was my acre. I stood in the shade of the cottonwoods, placing my hand on the cold iron of the pump. There was nothing else here, just the trees, the pump, and the endless land stretching out around me. It felt anticlimactic. What could possibly be hidden here? I remembered Elena's words. What you need to find next is hidden there, not near it, there. I examined the pump more closely. It was a simple machine, a cylinder bolted to a concrete base. I ran my hands over the housing, feeling the rough texture of the rusted metal. Then my fingers found it. On the back of the main cylinder, just above the base, was a small square plate held in place by 4 bolts. The bolts were old and rusted, but they didn't look as weathered as the rest of the pump. They looked like they had been removed and replaced at some point. Using a multi-tool from my backpack, I worked on the bolts. They were stubborn, groaning in protest, but one by one they gave way. With the last bolt removed, the plate came loose in my hand. Inside was a small, dark cavity, just big enough to hold a package. My fingers brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. I pulled it out. It was a tightly sealed bundle, heavy for its size. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was another metal container, this one a small, watertight document case. My breath caught in my throat. I opened the case. On top was another letter in Elena's distinctive script. Beneath it were several rolled-up documents. They looked like maps or charts. I picked up the letter. "Leo," it said, "if you have found this, then you are as smart and as stubborn as I had hoped. You are standing on the most important piece of land in this entire county. It is not the soil that has value, my boy. It is what lies beneath it. The documents in this case are geological surveys, reports I commissioned myself over the years from a man I trusted. They show the truth of this place. This land sits atop the largest undeveloped section of the Ogallala Aquifer in the state. And this well, the old homestead well on your 1 acre, is the primary access point. The water rights attached to your deed are senior rights, the oldest in the region. They predate everything. Without them, the other 500 acres are just dry pasture. With them, you control everything. Your cousins don't know. They think they stole a ranch. But what they really did was strand themselves in a desert, just feet from the only oasis. I had to sit down. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Water rights, aquifers. These were concepts I barely understood, but the implications were staggering. Elena hadn't just saved me an acre of land. She had saved me the key to the entire kingdom. She had outsmarted them all. The system, the courts, her own greedy family. She had played a long, patient game, and this was the checkmate. But the letter wasn't finished. There is a reason I have guarded this secret so fiercely. A few years ago, a development corporation called Mountain View Estates began buying up land in the next county. They build luxury ranchettes, golf courses, private resorts for the wealthy. They consume water at an astonishing rate, draining the wells of local ranchers and ruining the ecosystem. They made me an offer for this land once, a very generous one. I refused. I learned they had been in contact with Mark and Sarah. They were the ones who put the idea in their heads, who told them how to challenge my will, who likely paid their legal fees. They are partners, Leo. Your cousins want to sell this land to them. They want to pave this paradise and put up a parking lot. This is your inheritance, Leo. It is not a gift. It is a choice. You can sell this 1 acre to them. They will pay you a fortune for it. More money than you could ever imagine. You could walk away, start a new life, and never look back. No one would blame you. Or you can fight. You can use your rights to protect this place, to honor the promise I made to this land. It will be a hard road. They are powerful, and you are just one young man. But you are not alone. You have the law on your side, and you have the truth. The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, know that I love you, and I trust you. Elena. I sat there in the shade of the cottonwoods for hours, the letter in my lap, the geological surveys spread out on the ground beside me. The dry Wyoming wind rustled the leaves above, a sound like a gentle river. A choice, sell or fight, money or legacy, a new life, free from the past, or a hard life, dedicated to defending it. The thought of the money was intoxicating. I could have an apartment, a car, go to college. I could be normal. I could erase the years of being a ward of the state, of being the boy with nothing. The anger I'd felt toward my cousins began to curdle into something more complicated. They weren't just greedy, they were pawns in a much bigger game, manipulated by a faceless corporation that saw this beautiful wild land as nothing more than a commodity. They were willing to sell out their own aunt's legacy for a payday. It was a betrayal so profound it made my stomach ache. What would Elena have done? The answer was all around me. It was in the stubborn cabin, in the carefully preserved books, in the intricate, patient plan she had laid out for me. She had dedicated her life to protecting this place. Her love for it was palpable, a living presence in the air. Selling it would be like spitting on her grave. It would be validating everything the system had ever taught me about myself, that I was disposable, that my history didn't matter, that the easiest path was always the right one. And yet the fear was a cold knot in my chest. I was 18 years old. I had $400 and the cash from the box. I was nobody. Mountain View Estates was a giant. It was a fight I couldn't possibly win. Just then, I heard the sound of an engine. It was distant at first, a low rumble that grew steadily louder. I scrambled to my feet, quickly gathering the surveys and the letter, stuffing them back into my backpack. A cloud of dust was rising from the direction of the main road. A large black SUV was making its way down the barely there track that led toward the cabin, and by extension, toward me. My heart hammered against my ribs. They had come sooner than I expected. The SUV bounced and jostled over the rough terrain, finally pulling to a stop about 50 yards from my small stand of trees. 2 people got out, a man and a woman. Even from this distance, I recognized them from that faded childhood memory. Mark was tall and broad, with a confident, almost arrogant posture. Sarah was thinner, her movements sharp and bird-like. My cousins. They stood for a moment surveying the land, their land, before their eyes landed on me. Mark raised a hand in a gesture that was meant to be a friendly wave, but felt more like a summons. They started walking toward me. I took a deep breath, my hand instinctively going to the pocket where I had the key to Elena's cabin. The choice was no longer a theoretical exercise. It was here, walking toward me across the dry grass, its face smiling a predatory smile. "Leo, is that you?" Mark's voice was a loud, booming thing that seemed to trample the quiet of the plains. He had the kind of forced, hearty friendliness that immediately put me on guard. He was dressed in expensive jeans and a clean, pressed shirt, looking completely out of place in the rugged landscape. Sarah hung back slightly, her arms crossed, her eyes narrowed as she studied me. She looked like a hawk assessing its prey. "Wow, look at you," Mark continued, clapping me on the shoulder with a hand that felt as heavy as a slab of beef. "All grown up. We heard you were in town. Sorry we didn't get to the cabin to welcome you. Been busy with, well, with all this?" He swept his arm out, a gesture of ownership that made my blood run cold. "It's a lot to manage." "We were so sorry to hear about Elena," Sarah said, her voice thin and precise. There was no sorrow in it. It was a line she had practiced. "It must have been hard for you, hearing the news so late?" I just nodded, unable to find my voice. These were the people who had erased me from my own family's story, and they were standing here acting like this was some kind of happy reunion. "Listen," Mark said, getting down to business. "The lawyer, Abernathy, he told us about the situation. This little 1-acre plot. A clerical error, really. A loose end from when Dad first bought the land for Elena years ago. We're prepared to make it right, of course. We'll give you $5,000 for it, to clear up the deed, make it all clean." $5,000. The offer was so insulting it was almost funny. He saw the look on my face and clearly misinterpreted it. "Look, kid, I know it's not a lot, but let's be honest. This land is worthless. It's a patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere. $5,000 is more than fair. It'll help you get on your feet." He was trying to sound generous, like he was doing me a favor. He saw me as the same charity case the state had. A problem to be managed with a small, tidy check. The words of Elena's letter burned in my mind. "They will pay you a fortune for it." This wasn't a fortune. This was a test. They didn't know that I knew. They were probing, trying to see how little they could get away with. I found my voice. It was quiet, but it was steady. "No." Mark's smile faltered. "No. What do you mean, no?" "I mean, no, thank you. I'm not interested in selling." Sarah stepped forward, her sharp eyes fixed on mine. "Don't be a fool, Leo. What are you going to do with 1 acre of useless land? You can't live here. You can't build anything. It's nothing. Take the money." "It was my aunt's," I said simply. "It's the only thing I have left of her." Mark scoffed, his bonhomie evaporating, revealing the hard-edged impatience beneath. "Don't get sentimental. Elena was a strange woman. She let this whole place go to rot. We're trying to make something of it, create jobs, bring some life back to this county. You're standing in the way of progress." Progress. He meant a golf course. He meant luxury homes for people who would never understand the soul of this place. He meant destroying everything Elena had fought to protect. I looked from his face to Sarah's, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a scared kid. I felt a cold, hard anger. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had insulted her memory. They had underestimated her. And now they were underestimating me. "I'm not selling," I repeated, my voice stronger this time. "This acre is mine." Mark's face darkened. He took a step closer, trying to use his size to intimidate me. "You're making a big mistake. You have no idea what you're getting into. This is out of your league." "Maybe," I said, meeting his gaze. "But it's my mistake to make." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. "Fine, have it your way. Hold on to your precious patch of dirt. See what good it does you when you're broke and alone." He turned and stalked back toward the SUV, Sarah following silently in his wake. As they drove away, kicking up another plume of angry dust, I knew I had crossed a line. This was no longer a private matter. I had declared war, and I was standing on the battlefield, completely alone, or so I thought. The weight of that decision settled on me as I walked back to the cabin. The initial surge of adrenaline faded, replaced by a profound and terrifying sense of dread. What had I done? I had just provoked a wealthy development company and my own family. I had no resources, no allies, no plan. Just a secret and a stubborn refusal to back down. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it was sharp and painful. This was what I was fighting for, this wild, untamed silence, this sacred space. When I got back to the cabin, I lit an old kerosene lamp. its warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. The cabin felt different now. It was no longer just a shelter, it was my headquarters, my sanctuary. I pulled the metal box out from under the floor again. It was time to read the rest of Elena's story. The next letter I opened was not a letter at all. It was a journal, a thin, leather-bound book filled with her elegant script. It chronicled the last 5 years of her life, and as I read, the full picture began to emerge, more complex and heartbreaking than I could have imagined. She wrote about her love for the land, her daily walks, the changing of the seasons, the names she had for the hawks that circled overhead. She wrote about her loneliness, her quiet grief for my mother, her fierce, protective love for a nephew she only knew through faded photographs and sterile reports from social services. And she wrote about the fight. She detailed her first encounter with the surveyors from Mountain View Estates, how they had tried to dismiss her as a crazy old woman living in a shack. She described their escalating offers, their thinly veiled threats, their attempts to have her declared incompetent. She had fought them off, tooth and nail, using her sharp mind and her intimate knowledge of property law. Then she wrote about the diagnosis, the heart condition, the doctors telling her she didn't have much time. It was then that her plan began to form. She knew she couldn't win a protracted legal battle from the grave. She knew the system would fail me, so she devised a different strategy, a Trojan horse. She stopped paying her property taxes, letting the debt accumulate. She took out a small mortgage on the 500 acres, creating a lien. She made the property look as undesirable and legally complicated as possible. On paper, she made it look like she was failing, like the lonely old woman was finally losing her grip. It was a brilliant, painful act of self-sabotage designed for one purpose, to make the property seem like a liability to the court, but a manageable bargain for her greedy cousins. She knew they would take the bait. She was counting on their greed to blind them to the single, crucial acre she had hidden in plain sight. "They think they are predators," she wrote, "but a good predator is patient. They are merely scavengers taking what seems easy. They will not look for the heart of the thing because they do not believe it has one." I read late into the night, the lamplight flickering, the words on the page blurring together through my tears. This wasn't just a legal strategy, it was a testament of her love. She had spent the last years of her life orchestrating this, sacrificing her reputation and her peace of mind, all to give me this choice, to give me a chance to become the guardian of this land that she could no longer be. It was a burden, yes, but it was also the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. It was the gift of purpose. The next day, I walked into town. It was a long, dusty walk, but I needed the time to think. The journal had given me the history. The surveys gave me the ammunition. But I still had no idea how to fight a war. My first and only stop was the office of Abernathy and Sons. It was a small, cluttered space above the town's hardware store, smelling of old books and pipe tobacco. George Abernathy looked up from a mountain of paperwork as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Leo," he said, gesturing to a worn leather chair, "I heard you had some visitors yesterday. News traveled fast in a town like Creekbend." "They made me an offer," I said, sitting down. "I turned it down." A slow smile spread across his wrinkled face. "I had a feeling you might. Your aunt would be proud. She was the most stubborn woman I ever met, except perhaps for my late wife." He leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking in protest. "So what's your next move, son? Because your cousins just hired the biggest law firm in Cheyenne. They filed a motion this morning to contest the validity of your deed. They're claiming fraudulent conveyance." I felt a jolt of panic. "Can they do that?" "They can try. They'll argue Elena only separated that acre to deliberately and maliciously interfere with their property rights. They'll paint you as an opportunist and her as a vindictive old woman." It was exactly what Elena had predicted. I took a deep breath and pulled the oilcloth-wrapped package from my backpack. I laid the geological surveys and Elena's final letter on his desk. He picked up the first survey, his eyes scanning the charts and figures. He was silent for a long time. He read the second one, then the third. He put them down carefully and then read Elena's letter, his expression growing more and more grim. When he was finished, he took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. "Good Lord," he whispered. The old girl wasn't just stubborn, she was a genius. He looked at me, and, for the first time, I saw a flicker of fire in his tired eyes. Senior water rights, on the main tap to the aquifer, a developer's worst nightmare, or their holy grail. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the sleepy main street. "This changes everything. This isn't a property dispute anymore. It's a water war. And in Wyoming, that's a war you can win if you have the right kind of leverage." He turned back to me. "This is going to get ugly, Leo. They have money and influence. They'll try to bury us in paperwork, bleed us dry with legal fees. They'll drag your name and your aunt's name through the mud." "I don't care," I said, and I was surprised by the conviction in my own voice. "I'm not selling." He studied me for a long moment, a genuine, unforced smile touching his lips. "All right then," he said, sitting back down behind his desk. He pulled a fresh legal pad toward him. "Let's get to work. First thing we do is file a countersuit for harassment, and we file an injunction to prevent any surveying or drilling on their property until the water rights are fully adjudicated. That'll stop their development plans cold." He was no longer a tired old country lawyer. He was a general, planning a campaign. For the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't feel alone. I had an ally. I also had a community I didn't even know existed. As Abernathy and I worked, word began to spread through the small town. It started with a chatty clerk at the county records office, and it spread like wildfire. The story of the orphan boy who'd come back to claim his aunt's land, the forgotten acre that held the key to the whole valley's water supply, was the most exciting thing to happen in Creek Bend in years. People started to talk. Ranchers who had known and respected Elena, who had seen her stand up to the government and big corporations for years, started to voice their support. They knew what a company like Mountain View Estates would do to their valley. They had seen it happen in other places. Their own wells, their way of life, depended on that same aquifer. My fight was their fight. One evening, a grizzled old rancher named Hank stopped me on the street. He had a face like a leather map and hands the size of dinner plates. "You're Elena's boy, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I nodded. "Your aunt was a good woman," he said. "She helped us fight off a pipeline company 10 years back, knew the law better than any lawyer. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you let me know. The whole valley's behind you." It was a turning point. I had come to Creek Bend as a ghost, an outsider, but through Elena's legacy, I was becoming a part of something. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. I was fighting for a community. The money Elena had left me was enough to pay Abernathy's retainer and my living expenses for a few months. I moved out of the cabin, renting a small room in town so I wouldn't violate the court order, but I walked out to the property every single day. It was my touchstone, my sanctuary. Standing on my acre under the shade of the cottonwoods, I could feel her presence, her strength. The legal battle was a slow, grinding process. My cousin's lawyers were aggressive, filing motion after motion, trying to overwhelm us. But Abernathy was like a rock. He was methodical, patient, and he knew Wyoming water law inside and out. The injunction was granted, which was our first major victory. All work on the property had to stop. Mountain View Estates was furious. Their timeline was ruined. Their investors were getting nervous. The pressure mounted. They started playing dirty. A reporter from a Cheyenne newspaper showed up, writing a slanted story that painted me as a greedy opportunist holding the county's economic future hostage. They investigated my past, trying to dig up dirt from my time in the system. But there was nothing to find. My life had been too small, too quiet for any real scandals. All they found was a lonely kid who had been passed from one foster home to another. And in a town like Creekbend, that story didn't make me a villain. It made me one of them. The fight culminated not in a dramatic courtroom showdown, but in a quiet meeting in Abernathy's cluttered office. The head lawyer for Mountain View Estates, a slick man in a $1,000 suit, sat across the desk from us. My cousins weren't there. They had been sidelined by their powerful partners. The lawyer's name was Peterson, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice smooth and cold, "we are prepared to make you a final offer. We will purchase your 1-acre parcel and all associated mineral and water rights for the sum of $1 million. He said the number as if it were a magic word, a spell that could solve any problem. $1 million. My mind reeled. It was an impossible, life-altering sum of money. Everything I had ever dreamed of, everything I had ever lacked, was contained in that offer. I could walk away from all of this, a rich man. I could leave Creekbend and never look back. I looked at Abernathy. He was watching me, his expression neutral. He wasn't going to tell me what to do. This was my choice, my inheritance. I thought of Elena, alone in her cabin, writing those letters, trusting a boy she barely knew to understand. I thought of Hank the rancher and the other people in this town who had offered me their support, who were trusting me to protect their home. I thought of the wind in the cottonwoods and the silence of the plains. $1 million was the price of a life, but it was also the price of my soul. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the entire room. Peterson stared at me, his composure finally cracking. "No? Are you insane? This is $1 million. I know what it is," I said, "and I know what this land is, and it's not for sale." Abernathy finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "However," he said, leaning forward, "my client is a reasonable young man. He understands that Mountain View has investors to answer to, so he is prepared to make a counteroffer." Peterson looked stunned. "A counteroffer?" "That's right," Abernathy said, a predatory glint in his eye. "Mr. Vance is willing to sell you his water rights. Not the land, just the rights, on a lease basis, at a price that will make your golf course the most expensive patch of green in the United States. Or you and your clients can pack up your briefcases, and you can try to explain to your investors why your multi-million-dollar project is going to die of thirst, all because you couldn't outsmart a dead woman and an orphan." The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Peterson just stared, his mind clearly racing, processing the utter defeat in Abernathy's words. The war was over. We had won. The aftermath was not a sudden, cinematic victory, but a slow, quiet unfolding. Mountain View Estates, faced with the prospect of either paying an exorbitant price for water or abandoning their project, chose to cut their losses. They packed up and left, their surveyor's stakes pulled from the ground like rotten teeth. The big law firm in Cheyenne quietly withdrew their lawsuit. My cousins left with a massive piece of land they couldn't develop, and a pile of their own legal bills were broken. I saw Mark once in town. He avoided my eyes, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He had lost, and he knew it. A few months later, Abernathy told me they had sold the 500 acres. They didn't sell it to another developer. They sold it for a fraction of what they had hoped for to a conservation trust, a statewide environmental group that Elena had secretly been in contact with for years. It was the final move in her posthumous chess game. The trust had been waiting in the wings the whole time, ready to act the moment the developers were out of the picture. The land was safe. My 1 acre, the heart of the valley, was now surrounded by a permanent 500-acre buffer of protected wilderness. It was to be named the Elena Vance Nature Preserve. I wasn't rich. The $1 million offer was gone, a ghost of a life I had chosen not to live. But I wasn't poor, either. As part of the deal, the Conservation Trust hired me. I was to be the preserve's first official warden and caretaker. My job was to live on the land, to maintain the trails, to be its guardian. They paid me a modest salary, enough to live on, enough to be comfortable. My home was the cabin. Elena's cabin. With the help of Hank and some of the other ranchers, I spent that first autumn restoring it. We fixed the sagging porch, re-chinked the logs, and installed a small solar panel system on the roof for electricity. It was hard, physical work, and I loved every minute of it. With every swing of the hammer, I felt like I was rebuilding not just a house, but my own life. I was putting down roots in the truest sense of the word. I became a part of Creek Bend. I was no longer the outsider, the orphan boy. I was Leo, Elena's boy, the kid who had stood up for the valley. People would wave to me in town, stop to chat, ask me how the preserve was doing. I had found something I had never realized I was missing, a community, a place to belong. One evening, sitting on the newly repaired porch of my cabin, I watched the sun set over the rolling hills. The sky was a brilliant, impossible blaze of color. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of pine and clean, cold earth. I thought about the word inheritance. I had always associated it with money, with property, with things you could count. But I was wrong. My inheritance wasn't 500 acres of land or $1 million. It was a choice. It was a purpose. It was a legacy of courage and conviction, passed down to me by a woman I had barely known, but now loved with all my heart. She hadn't left me something to own. She had left me something to become. The scars from my past were still there. They always would be. But they no longer defined me. They were just a part of my story, a story that was still being written. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the pen. This journey taught me that the most valuable things in life are rarely the ones with a price tag. It's the legacy we honor, the community we build, the purpose we choose. My aunt gave me more than land. She gave me a reason to stand for something. She trusted me to see the value in something the rest of the world had dismissed as worthless. And maybe you've felt that way too. Maybe you've been underestimated or had to fight for something that mattered only to you. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to choose the harder right over the easier wrong, I want you to know that you're not alone. This channel is a community for people who understand that our real inheritance is the strength we find in our struggles. So please subscribe and become a part of it. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me, what is the most important thing you've ever fought to protect? It doesn't have to be a piece of land. It could be a memory, a principle, a person, a dream. Your story matters. Let's share them with each other, because in the end, that's how we build a world where everyone has a place to belong. Thank you for listening.